What was it like to live for years in a world where the mud could swallow you, the rats grew fat, and the air itself could turn into a slow, choking death? We often remember wars by their dates, their generals, their treaties. But the men who fought in the trenches of the First World War remember something else: the silence between shells, the letters that arrived too late, the strange Christmas when enemies shook hands across no man's land. It was a war fought in filth and frost, and yet, in that horror, something fragile and beautiful survived: humanity itself. If stories of ordinary endurance speak to your heart, consider subscribing to Little Historical. We don't just recount events, we sit beside the people who live them. And if you'd like to hear more, a like is a quiet way to say you were here. Tonight, we step into the mud and the wire, not to glorify war, but to remember the men who walked through it. He was born in a place so poor that even the candlelight seemed to flicker with apology. The floor beneath his first breath was packed dirt, cold from a Kentucky winter that did not care for the names of future presidents. His mother called him Abraham, but in the wilderness of that frontier, names carried little weight. What mattered was whether you could swing an axe, clear a field, survive the next season without losing someone to the milk sickness that crept through the lowlands like a quiet thief. And when Abraham was 9, that thief came for Nancy Hanks Lincoln. She died in the small cabin where she had taught her son to read from a worn Bible, her voice already thin, her hands folded over his as if she could press something permanent into him before she left. He never spoke much of it afterward, but those who knew him would say that something in the boy's eyes changed: a stillness, a depth, a way of looking at the world as though he already understood that loss was not something you got over but something you carried. Thomas Lincoln, his father, saw only a pair of hands. The boy needed to work, to split rails, to pull his weight on land that gave back little. But Sarah Bush Johnston, the widow who came to be his stepmother, saw something else. She brought books into that raw, unfinished household: Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, a collection of Shakespeare that smelled of dust and borrowed time. She watched the boy read by firelight long after the others had gone to sleep, his face half illuminated, his lips moving silently over words that must have seemed like keys to a world far beyond the Kentucky hills. There was a hunger in him, not for food, but for understanding. He walked miles to borrow a volume, sometimes trading a day's labor just to turn a few pages. Neighbors called him lazy, but what they mistook for idleness was something else entirely: a mind already reaching, already questioning, already preparing itself for questions no one around him was asking. The grief of his mother never left him. It folded into his silence, into the long pauses between his words, into the melancholy that would later become so familiar to those who loved him. But it also gave him something that no textbook could. He learned early that the world does not explain itself, that loss does not come with reasons, and that a man must build his own meaning from what remains. In that log cabin, under borrowed light, with the weight of his mother's absence still pressing against his chest, Abraham Lincoln began shaping the thing that would eventually carry a nation. Not ambition, not hunger for power, but a quiet, relentless drive to make sense of a world that had already shown him its hardest edges. And when he finally left those hills, his hands still carried the calluses of the axe, but his mind carried something far more dangerous: a belief that words could hold the same weight as steel. What he would do with that belief, what it would cost him, and how it would one day echo across a divided nation, would come later. But the foundation was laid in the dark of a Kentucky cabin, by a boy who read while others slept, already learning that the deepest wounds often shape the strongest hands. He carried the hills with him when he left: the scent of damp earth, the weight of an axe that had fit his hand since boyhood, and the silence of a mother who had died before she could see what he would become. New Salem was not much of a town, just a cluster of cabins along the Sangamon River where men traded in whiskey and ambition and the occasional story that grew taller with each telling. But for Abraham Lincoln, it was the first place where people stopped seeing the calluses and started listening to the words. He took a job at a general store, though he was better at telling stories than keeping accounts. When a customer overpaid by a few cents, he would walk miles to return the change, not because he was virtuous, but because the thought of keeping what wasn't his sat in his chest like a stone he could not swallow. That was how the name came: Honest Abe, whispered at first, then repeated, then carried so far that even he could not escape its weight. The store failed, as stores often did on the frontier, but Lincoln had already begun to understand something that would shape the rest of his life. A man's reputation was a currency more lasting than any coin. He borrowed law books from a lawyer who took pity on him, and he read them the same way he had read Shakespeare in the cabin, by firelight, after the work was done, when the rest of the world had fallen quiet. There was no classroom, no mentor who guided his hand. Just a tall, gaunt man with dirt under his nails and a hunger that looked, to those who did not know him, like loneliness. And perhaps it was. He was 23 when he first ran for the state legislature, and he lost, but the loss did not discourage him as much as it should have. He had learned early that failure was a kind of teacher, and he had learned it in a cabin where the wind came through the walls and his mother's voice had faded into the winter air. When he finally won a seat 2 years later, he did not arrive with grand speeches or polished manners. He arrived with stories, long, meandering tales that made men forget their quarrels and lean a little closer to the fire. They did not know then that behind the wit was a mind that was always counting, always calculating the distance between what was right and what was possible. They did not see the nights when he sat alone in his boarding room, staring at the ceiling, the old grief rising in him like water through a crack in a dam. The law became his anchor. He studied it not just as a profession but as a kind of moral geometry, a way of drawing lines between justice and the mess of human lives. And when he passed the bar and moved to Springfield, the capital of Illinois, he did so with a reputation already trailing behind him like a shadow. Honest, yes, but also strange, melancholy, a man who could make a jury weep with a story and then retreat into a silence so deep it seemed to have its own gravity. Springfield gave him something New Salem never could: a stage. He took cases other lawyers avoided: murder trials, disputes between neighbors, the tangled knots of debt and betrayal. He argued not with flourish but with a plainness that felt, to those who heard him, like truth itself. And yet, even as his name began to travel beyond the circuit courts, there was something in him that remained unfinished, a wound that had never quite closed, a question he had been asking since the night his mother died. What is a man worth when the world has already shown him that nothing lasts? He was still asking that question when he met Mary Todd, a woman whose sharp mind and fiercer temper would test the patience he had built from years of holding himself together. But that story, the courtship, the marriage, the children who would come and go like seasons, belongs to the next chapter, the one where a country lawyer begins to look beyond the boundaries of Illinois and see, for the first time, a nation cracking under its own weight. The quiet years in Springfield were never truly quiet. Behind the careful arguments in the courtroom, behind the stories he told to juries and the way he could make a witness unravel with nothing more than a patient question, there was a man listening to something the rest of the country was trying to ignore. He had married Mary Todd, a woman whose intelligence matched his and whose temper could turn a small house into a storm. They loved each other in the way that fire loves oxygen: necessary, consuming, sometimes destructive. And in the rooms above a law office, they buried a child. Edward was 4 years old when the fever took him, and Lincoln, who had already learned to carry grief like a second skin, found himself standing at a grave in the winter cold, his hands empty, his throat too tight for words. Mary's sorrow burned hot, his turned inward, feeding the melancholy that had followed him since Kentucky. But the country was beginning to crack, and a man who had spent his life holding himself together was about to be asked to hold an entire nation. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 tore open a wound that had been festering since the founding. It allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery, and to Lincoln, this was not merely bad policy. It was a betrayal of the idea that liberty could be the inheritance of all men, not a privilege to be voted away by those who claimed to speak for the people. He had disliked slavery for as long as he could remember, calling it morally wrong, but he had never been a radical. Now he found himself speaking again, not with the measured tone of a lawyer seeking a verdict, but with something closer to desperation. He spoke in county courthouses, in dusty halls, to crowds that gathered to hear this tall, awkward man who could make the abstract feel like a wound in your own chest. And when Stephen Douglas, the most powerful Democrat in the West, came to Illinois to defend the right of territories to choose, Lincoln followed him from town to town, not shouting, not threatening, but asking a question so simple it seemed to hang in the air like smoke: can a nation remain half slave and half free? He lost the Senate race in 1858. But the debates with Douglas had done something strange. They had lifted him from the obscurity of prairie lawyer to a figure whose words were printed in newspapers across the country. People who had never seen his face began to recognize the name. They read his arguments, heard his voice in their minds, and some of them began to believe that this man, with his plain clothes and his sad eyes, might be the one to speak for a country that had forgotten how to listen to itself. By 1860, the Republican Party, fractured and uncertain, turned to him not because he was the favorite but because in a divided field, he was the one man no one could quite bring themselves to oppose. And on a cold November night, in Springfield, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln received word that he had been elected the 16th President of the United States. He sat in the telegraph office, his long legs folded awkwardly beneath him, and when the news came, he did not cheer. He looked at the faces around him, then at his own hands, and said something that sounded less like triumph than acceptance. The South did not wait. Before he could even pack his papers, before he could say goodbye to the graves of his son and his mother and the small, ordinary life he had built, 7 states had already left the Union. The country he was about to lead was already breaking apart, and the man who had spent his life learning to hold his own grief in silence was about to discover that some burdens cannot be carried alone. What came next, the war, the proclamation, the words that would outlive him, waited on the other side of a train ride to Washington, where a nation watched and wondered whether the rail splitter from the frontier could keep the Union from splintering altogether. The train carried him through towns he had never seen, past crowds that gathered at depots just to watch him pass. They did not know him, not really. They knew the stories, the rail splitter, the honest lawyer, the man who had risen from a cabin to the highest office in the land. But what they saw when the train slowed was a face already aged beyond its years, eyes that held something heavier than ambition. Washington in 1861 was a city of marble and fear, a capital waiting for a war that no one yet knew how to fight. He took the oath of office on a March morning, his hand on a Bible open to a page he had chosen himself, and when he finished speaking, his words were not of conquest or vengeance. They were words meant to hold, to stitch, to plead. But the South had already fired on Fort Sumter before he could unpack his papers, and the war that came was unlike anything the nation had imagined. It was not a season of glorious charges. It was 4 years of boys drowning in mud, of mothers reading lists of names they never thought would include their sons, of a president who walked the halls of the White House at night because sleep would not come. In the middle of that darkness, he began to write. Not orders or proclamations alone, though those mattered. He wrote words that seemed to rise from somewhere deeper than policy, words that carried the weight of a man who had spent his life asking what a nation owed to the idea that all men are created equal. The Emancipation Proclamation was one such document, carefully worded, legally cautious, yet in its cold lines, it declared something that could never be taken back. But the words that would outlive him came later, in a small town in Pennsylvania, on a battlefield so soaked with blood that the ground itself seemed to mourn. He was not the main speaker that day. Another man spoke for 2 hours, his voice rolling over the crowd with practiced elegance. Then Lincoln rose, his tall frame casting a shadow across the platform, and he spoke for barely 2 minutes. 272 words. He folded the paper afterward, uncertain whether anyone had heard him at all. But those words, for 47 years ago, became something the speaker himself could not have anticipated. They were not about victory. They were about redefinition, about a nation that must be reborn in the crucible of its own failure, about the proposition that government of the people, by the people, for the people, should not perish from the earth. He wrote more words as the war ground toward its terrible end. A second inaugural address, delivered in March of 1865, when the capital was still draped in rain and the end was finally in sight. In it, he spoke not of triumph but of forgiveness, with malice toward none, with charity for all. He was not a man who had emerged from the war unchanged. The face that looked out from photographs in those final weeks was carved with lines that no light could soften. He had lost another son inside the White House, Willie, who had died of typhoid fever while the war raged beyond the gates. He had carried that grief in silence, as he had carried every grief since the cabin in Kentucky. And when the war finally ended, when Lee surrendered at Appomattox and the bells rang out across the North, he did not celebrate. He walked the streets of Richmond, the fallen capital of the Confederacy, and sat at a desk where Jefferson Davis had once sat, and he told a story to the men around him, a story about a boy who had read by candlelight and learned that some truths are worth more than victory. The words he left behind were not many. No memoir, no grand testament. But in the quiet of a theater box on an April evening, with his wife beside him and the laughter of the audience rising like a tide, those words were all that remained. He would not see the peace he had imagined. He would not know how many generations would carry his sentences in their memory. But when the lantern went out, when the long silence finally fell, the words had already begun their work, traveling beyond the grave, beyond the war, beyond the small, difficult life of a man who had never stopped asking what it meant to be free.